Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin, and I'm your host, and we have a returning guest, friend of the show, Mr. David Horowitz. Folks, let me tell you something. He's put out a new book, I Can't Breathe, How a Racial Hoax is Killing America. This brother did it again. New York Times best-selling author and just unquestionably one of the great intellectuals of our time. Mr. Horowitz, thank you for your time with me today. I really appreciate it. And what I'd like to do, Mr. Horowitz, you wrote an article here, I think it was published in October 5, Why I Wrote I Can't Breathe. And what I wanted to do is to read excerpts from that article and then have you comment.
Sure.
We'll do that 3 times. Then at the end, as you know, I'm out of Louisville, Kentucky, and I can't help myself. We got to talk a little bit about Breonna Taylor. Yeah. So let's go ahead and get straight into it. The first comment here, since I was a child and marched in my first political demonstration on behalf of civil rights, a central concern of my life has been the equality of all people. As a Jew, I was aware of the painful effects of prejudice, and as the child of communists, I was involved in the left's effort to denigrate the United States and weaken it for its enemies by exploiting injustices to Black Americans. As an adult, I came to learn that the left did not care about actual Black people or their welfare. It was only interested in using them as battering ram against their country. Could you give me a little bit more on that?
Well, yeah, I wrote an article actually, which is up on the web. It's called Anatomy of a Lynching. And it's about this the most famous lynching, which Billie Holiday wrote a song about called Southern Trees Bear a Strange Fruit. So it's the people will know just from the photograph. It's a crowd of white people and 2 guys facing the camera point to 2 Black bodies hanging from the trees.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about this story is, well, first of all, what is a lynching? A lynching is when people don't trust the criminal justice system to bring justice. They take the law into their own hands. So it's always first they want a verdict. So these 3 young Blacks were sprung out of jail by the lynch mob. They had already been arrested for a brutal murder of, the claim was that they had murdered this young man and raped his girlfriend. But what was fascinating to me about this particular lynching was that there was a 3rd guy who did not get out of his car. They were all 3 in a car. Did not get out of the car and kill the white guy, the young white guy. And somebody in the crowd, I don't know if they were there or what, spoke up for him. One of the lynch mob people spoke up on his behalf. And so the lynch mob did not kill him. They strung up the 2 guys who were responsible for murdering and robbing this young man. I actually heard this on National Public Radio, if you can believe it, and was an interview with him, that he went on, he served a 5 to 7 year sentence for being an accomplice, since he was in the car with them when they drove to the site where they murdered, or where they hung these 2 guys. He spent 5 to 7 years in jail, and then he formed a national civil rights organization. And you can find this, I think you can find it by typing into Wikipedia, lynching in Indiana. So this guy, it showed, I mean, that the caricatures, look, obviously lynching had a huge racial element, and obviously it's a horrible thing. But it shows that life is a lot more complex than all of these political myths around it. Because here were people in the lynch mob deciding that this guy was innocent and shouldn't be strung up along with his companions. And I told the story because it came to my attention as a young person. I was maybe 10 years old. The Russians were murdering, but executing the leaders of the East European communist parties, who were all Jews, because the communists were Jew haters. And they put out a book called We Charge Genocide, and it had this picture of the lynching. And Paul Robeson, who was my hero as a young leftist, had written an introduction or whatever, and they brought this petition to Congress to indict the United States for lynchings, but they weren't really interested in lynchings. They were interested in covering for the Soviets who were murdering Jews in Eastern Europe. It's a very interesting article called Anatomy of a Lynching, but what it is it tells you how political these things are and how you can't trust what they look like at first sight. You have to really take a look at them. But one of the reasons the communists were as successful as they were was, the plight of Black Americans, cried out for justice. So the cause, as it was portrayed, was very good. The cause as it was enacted was not so good. But it remained. I was 10 years old when I marched in this march, 1948. I was 9 actually. So it made a deep impression on me, and I wound up later in life supporting the Black Panther Party, another mistake. I raised a lot of money, over $100,000, which would be a hell of a lot more money now. Yes. I bought a Baptist church in East Oakland and turned it over to the Panthers. It's shameful what I did. I remember the minister, they had been overtaken by the inner city, so all the neighborhoods around them were Black, and they were white Baptists. And the last thing he asked me is, I hope you're not going to turn this over to the Black Panther Party or the Nation of Islam. Oh no, I said, I had created something called the Oakland Community Learning Center. And I discovered to my grief that the Black Panthers were a criminal gang. It always bothered me, we created this church in East Oakland, but the Black community never showed up. It was always, I knew the Panthers because I was working with them. It was always only Panthers. It was, and that's because the Black community knew they were gangsters and killers. But of course we white radicals had contempt for, in a way, it was a contempt for Black people. We just thought, they're not politically sophisticated enough to support murderers and gangsters.
Right.
In retrospect, it seems sort of amusing, but it was very painful at the time. Anyway, I recruited my bookkeeper. I was editing the largest magazine that left. I recruited her to keep the books because I had made it a tax-exempt foundation. And of course, if Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton were white, they'd be in jail for the way they used their 501c3s politically.
Yes.
But in any case, the Panthers wound up murdering this woman. And that was one large step out of the left. The other was when I saw they didn't care about the Vietnamese at all. It's a similar thing here. It's like white radicals don't give a damn about black people. If they did,
Yes.
they'd be really upset by all the homicides in the inner city. And they'd be upset to do something about them, but they're not. There's not one Black Lives Matter martyr that's a young black killed by another young black, because it doesn't fit their political agendas.
Didn't fit their narrative. Yeah.
Anyway, so that's so it's my whole life. This has been my life. And the way I came to do this book, well, I knew immediately that George Floyd was not the victim of a racial killing. And how did I know that? Well, because there were 4 officers who were charged with his murder. One of them is black, who actually a young man who joined the Minneapolis police force to reform it. And the other was Asian. So how does race factor into that equation? It actually doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody noticed that. Nobody said anything about that. To me, you could say a lot of things about the procedure that was used and whatnot. But the one thing you can't say is that it was a racial killing. And yet scores of people, hundreds of cities, ravaged by this anger against white cops. Now, the interesting thing is, I think my book is the only place you can find this, except I give a footnote and it will tell you where you can find the video, actually, of 60 Minutes, but right after the Derek Chauvin trial. And when you think about it, this was a lynching. The whole Black Lives Matter campaign are lynchings. First comes the verdict, then you get maybe the autopsy, then maybe you get an investigation, then you get a trial, and then of course you get the same verdict and the execution, or in his case, 40 years in jail. I mean, that's what a lynch mob means. You start with the verdict, and you don't really care about the facts. If somebody raises the facts, they're a racist or what have you. So Keith Ellison is the Attorney General for the state of Minnesota, and he was interviewed on 60 Minutes shortly after the trial. Now, Keith Ellison spent 11 years as a spokesperson for really the most vicious racist in the country, which is Louis Farrakhan. Farrakhan is a Jew hater, he's a gay basher, he's a white hater, and he hates America. It's a terrible thing when black people, this is one of the real crimes of the left, to turn black people against the country, which they were here. Black people were in this country in the 17th century, for crying out to us, before the vast majority of white people or their ancestors ever got here. So there's nobody really more American than Black America. And yet the left, in its devious ways, has turned good sections of the Black community against their own country. It's really, really terrible. And even the term African American, of course, an Italian American comes from a country. Africa is a continent, and I forget how many languages are spoken. There was a book by a Black Washington Post reporter. He spent 3 years on assignment in Africa. And he said, I have nothing in common with these people.
I remember that book.
Black Americans are Black Americans. That's what they are, Americans first and foremost. Anyway, Keith Ellison spent 11 years as a spokesperson for Louis Farrakhan. And Farrakhan had traveled to Iran to chant with the mullahs, "Death to America." This guy is some piece of work. And, unfortunately, there's a lot of people who will follow him. So 60 Minutes asked Keith Ellison, he's the chief prosecutor, mind you, on the Derek Chauvin case. He's the guy who set the charges. He's the guy who ran the prosecutors. And I asked him, was there a racial element in the killing of George Floyd? And his answer, we couldn't find any. We couldn't find a racial element in the killing of George Floyd. This, from a Farrakhan follower, who it means they couldn't find one witness to Derek Chauvin using a racial epithet against a black in a fit of anger. Mm-hmm. We all know everybody, when they get really steamed, they'll say anything. I mean, people instantly regret what they say. They couldn't find one statement by this guy that would suggest that there was a racial element in the murder.
Let me stop you there. This is a Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host, and we have with us David Horowitz, a New York Times bestselling author, and unquestionably one of the great intellectuals of our time, scholars, writers of our time. I also just want to briefly not talk about it, but show this book here. Mr. Horowitz, is just to let you know I'm been a long-time fan. And, Indoctrination U, The Left's War Against Academic Freedom. Any book you buy by David Horowitz is going to enlighten you. Mr. Horowitz, let's go on to another comment before we talk about Breonna Taylor. This is a quote out of your article. Today, Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream has been realized. Systemic racism was outlawed almost 60 years ago by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There has never been so diverse and equal a society as America. It has elected a Black American to its highest office twice. There is no other country in the world that has elected the member of a previously oppressed minority as its president.
Or as its national security advisor, or as its attorney general.
Yes. Yeah, it's true.
The chief racist in the country is Joe Biden, who said on his inauguration day that America, every aspect of American life is touched by systemic racism. The Civil Rights Act outlawed systemic racism. If there was one, there are 18,000 local police departments. Even if there was one rotten police department that was racist, if there was like one case of systemic racism, there would be a tsunami of lawsuits because it's illegal. There would be millions of dollars forked over because it's illegal. There are no, and let's say, like most Democrats seem to think these days that all white people are racist. Assume that's true. There are thousands of Black attorneys, district attorneys, attorney general, mayors, city council members, members of Congress, police chiefs. Almost every major city has a Black police chief. How would it be possible to carry out systemic racism unless all those people are race traders, which is something that the leftist says all the time. But it's ridiculous. There's money involved. You got a case of systemic racism, you make yourself rich. It's really simple.
Good point.
Look, I quoted in my book the summary of it. You can see institutional racism is illegal. It's as simple as that.
Well, Dinesh D'Souza in his book, I think it's called "The End of Racism," makes the same point. I mean, and just makes the same point. And here in Louisville, time and time again, people stand up and say, where's the systemic racism? Name the bank, name the company.
Yeah, it's always inadvertent, unconscious racism, unconscious bias.
Right.
I mean, come on, that gives the whole game away. But people go along with it because I know there's a lot of white people that feel guilty about Black slavery. Now, look, slavery is an unpleasant institution, putting it mildly, but it existed for 3,000 years in all societies and was considered normal. It was never denounced as immoral by anybody, not Jesus, not Moses, nobody, until white Christian males at the end of the 18th century, Wilberforce in England and Thomas Jefferson in America, said it's immoral. Everybody, every human being has a God-given right to liberty. That's it, folks. That was the end of slavery. Slavery existed in Africa for 1,000 years before a white person ever set foot there. It was not, it really didn't have a racial element until the middle of the 19th century. And it's ironic, the South was caught in a bind. The slave South wanted to have their cause defending, the constitutional and the founding. They wanted to be patriots. But there in America's birth certificate was all men are created equal and have this God-given right to liberty. So they had to argue that blacks were inferior. That's where it comes from, in order to make their case. Because if all men are created equal and they have this God-given right, then slavery is immoral. The thing is, and I don't really, I usually put things very bluntly. America is God's gift to black people. As I say, slavery existed for 1,000 years in Africa. If slavery is anybody's original sin, it's Africa's. America inherited a slave system from the English, and our founders declared slavery immoral, against the word of God at the outset. And within a little over a generation, it was abolished. Within 20 years of the signing of the Constitution, slavery was abolished in all the northern colonies. Why wasn't it also abolished in the South at the same time? Well, there's all these bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young people who've been to these indoctrination schools who think they're morally superior to the founders of America by being anti-slavery. Here's the reality. The two greatest powers in the world at the time were England, a slave-owning empire, and Spain. And Spanish slavery was far, far worse than the English version in America. And what do I mean by far, far worse? The island of Hispaniola, where Columbus landed, had 8 million Arawaks. And within a century, well, it was less than a century, they were all dead. Spanish slavery killed people. Portuguese slavery. In Brazil, they had to replace the slave population every year because they died. It was so brutal. But in America, the slave trade was outlawed in 1807. And so you have a benchmark there. Between 1807 and 1860, you couldn't import slaves. And yet the American slave population grew 4 times. There were 1 million slaves in 1807, and there were 4 million in 1860. So I think it's Madison who said that slavery was the worst dominion of man over man, the most horrific. But if the North had abolished slavery in 1776 or 87, the South would have joined forces with the British or the Spaniards for that matter. And they would have won the war. They would have destroyed, we almost lost the Civil War when it was fought 50 years later. And slavery could have existed for another 100 years. So people don't take into account the real world possibilities that people were facing at the time. So I want this one other thing to register. Here you had 360,000 white Americans who gave their lives to free the slaves. If you could find me a brown, and slavery still exists in Africa, Muslim slavery is all over the world. If you could find me a brown or a black society where you had even 100,000 people volunteer or be drafted to liberate white slaves, we could have another conversation. But Black people should own this country. It's theirs as much as there's nobody to challenge them. And yet the sinister left wants to turn them against their own country. It's just terrible.
Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host. Go to my website, booktalkwithcorbin.com, and you will be able to find other great interviews we had with Mr. David Horowitz. Mr. Horowitz, we only got a few minutes left.
Let me do Taylor quickly.
In your book, I Can't Breathe, you sort of profile 26 people. You know, they were like as you put it, the poster children for Black Lives Matter. And one of them was Breonna Taylor. It's very important to us, obviously, for obvious reasons, here in Louisville, Kentucky. Talk a little bit about what you said about the Breonna Taylor case.
Yeah, Breonna, okay, Oakland Winfrey, what, 26 billboards, one for every year, Breonna Taylor's life, calling for the indictment of the police, obviously for murder, and claimed that Breonna Taylor was killed in her sleep in her bed, an innocent person. Nothing could be further from the truth. Breonna Taylor, and she's always described as a medical technician, but she hadn't worked at that for 3 years. Breonna Taylor was the accomplice of a major drug dealer in Louisville. And let's pause for a second. This guy's business was killing Black people, selling heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, whatever, to Black Americans. That's his business. That's what Breonna Taylor helped him with. And how did she do that? She used her bank account to hide his criminal profits. She used her mailing address to be part of his distribution apparatus for the drugs he was dealing. She rented a car for him where a dead body turned up in the trunk, which should have been people do stupid things for the heart. We've all done it. But this should have been a warning to her, at least. The police had a no-knock warrant, but they announced their presence.
Yes.
So they showed up at her door. And what happened was that Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend, her current boyfriend, jumped out of bed. And the boyfriend, like an idiot, fired at the police at the door in the direction of the door where the sound came from. Well, police, they have families they want to come home to alive. So they have this saying, it's called pray and spray. And the idea is if you're being fired on in the dark where you can't see where the shots are coming from, you don't know how many people are shooting at you, you don't know where precisely they're located, you pray and you spray the area with bullets in the hopes you'll kill them before they kill you. It's as straightforward as that.
Yes.
And yet the Democrats, the worst enemy of Black people is the Democrat Party, absolute worst. Every inner city in America is controlled 100% by the Democrat Party and has been for 50 to 100 years. Every injustice in the inner city that policy can affect, Democrats are 100% responsible for. And here's one of them. They gave $12 million to Breonna Taylor's family for wrongful death. It wasn't a wrongful death. She was killed resisting arrest by police that didn't even see. I mean, if they were out to kill Black people, why not shoot the Black boyfriend first? None of it makes any sense.
Yes.
And George Taylor's family got $27 million for a lifelong drug addict and criminal. Why is George Floyd? Why are there statues of George Floyd? He was a scumbag. That's who George Floyd was. It's an insult to Black people to make him a typical Black person. He'd been arrested 9 times. In addition, between the ages of 13 and 46, 5 years taken out of commission because he was in jail. What for? For robbing a Black mother by pointing his gun at her womb while his gang members looted her house. How terrifying was that for that woman?
Yes.
It's the world turned upside down. And I have to say that what gives me I think we're one election away from losing the country. That's how dire. But what gives me hope is what all the black people I see standing up now and defying Black Lives Matter and these white leftists who don't give a damn about black people, but just want to use them as a battering ram. Because for a black person to stand up against this is 100 times harder than for a white person. I have nothing but contempt for the white people who go along with the garbage and the mythology.
Well, we'll have to conclude the interview with that. And I just wanted to say, go ahead, Doctor. Yes, go ahead.
You hold that up?
Yes, I can't breathe. How racial hoax is killing America. Where can we get that book?
Amazon, Target, Walmart, frontpagemag.com, which is my website.
Okay.
Able to get it anywhere.
Okay. And folks, let's make this another David Horowitz, New York Times bestseller. I mean, let's go out there and get it. And then, Mr. Horowitz said earlier, what gives me hope? Well, what gives me hope is people like David Horowitz and his books and his effort and his passion. That's what gives me hope. He is a phenomenal brother. We got to get that book. I Can't Breathe, How Racial Hoax is Killing America. Give us a couple of those. Give me your website, just your website.
Yeah. Well, all my books are at horowitzbooks.com.
Okay. And I think that's the better place for us to buy them so that we know we're getting them from the source and we know that the source is profiting from it, because, we got to make sure that every time you put something out, it's a bestseller so that you can do some more research and put out another one. Folks, we've got to listen to David Horowitz.
My concern is having people read the book.
Yes.
I've been doing pretty well as a writer. This is a mission. I couldn't do it if there weren't black people standing up. What would happen? I'd just be erased.
Yes.
That's what would happen.
Okay. Brother, thank you so much for your time today. I always love interviewing you, and hopefully we'll be able to do it again sometime.
Sure. I got another book coming out in May. See you then.
Okay, you definitely. Thank you so much.